Hi, I'm Evan Oxidal, a teacher of history at Watchung Hills Regional High School in New Jersey. And this video is about Abraham Lincoln and the press during the Civil War. Over 300 newspapers during the course of the Civil War were suppressed, either through the arrest of an editor, the actual shutdown of the paper, the suspension of mailings out to their readership, or, in some cases, the censoring of the telegraph wires into their offices from Washington, D.C. Now, rather than going through a long list of examples of the suppression of the media, we're going to focus today on 4 particular examples. And they are the Christian Observer and Amasa Converse, the Dubuque Herald and a man named Dennis Mahoney, the Chicago Times, perhaps the biggest example we'll talk about, and finally, because we're from New Jersey, an example of a New Jersey suppression with the Newark Evening Journal. Now, I think it should be important to understand that Abraham Lincoln understood there'd be criticism of his policies, the war, and everything else going on at the time of his presidency. And even despite that, there was this fine line between what constituted freedom of the press and also sedition. And sometimes those lines were blurred. So Lincoln, although he showed restraint in some examples, his followers, like his Postmaster General or Edward Stanton, his Secretary of War, they didn't always show that restraint. And usually, these newspapers were suppressed by the military rather than by orders of Lincoln himself, or by Secretary of State Seward, or, as I mentioned, the Postmaster General. In this first example, this person was targeted by the War Department as well as the State Department. It involved a man named Amasa Converse. Amasa Converse was a Presbyterian minister from Philadelphia, and he published a weekly newspaper known as the Christian Observer. The Christian Observer was a really small paper, not very well known, but it had an interesting distinction in that after the war began, it was one of the only publications to operate both in Richmond, Virginia, as the Confederacy, as well as Philadelphia. And this drew attention on the part of the post office as well as the State Department. Now, adding to that was the fact that Converse was a very strong critic of the war and of Lincoln's policies. And after publishing a really damning editorial after the Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861, Converse's newspaper was raided in the early pre-dawn hours and was seized by the military, and Converse was arrested. Now, Converse was acquitted and was able to go off on his merry way. But before he did that, he wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln on August 28th, 1861. And here's something he had to say. As far as I'm aware, in all other countries where the most rigid surveillance over the press is maintained, the governments are in the habit of giving some warning to the publishers of papers that in their course is not agreeable, in order that they be more careful in the future. It has been left for our free and republican government to introduce the practice of seizure without warning, suppression without monition. That's a very interesting statement. Now, Converse is an older man. He's 66 years old, and there was a financial stake here for him because his newspaper in Richmond was just basically not shut down, but it was hard to operate in 2 cities with the war going on. Not only that, but after he wrote that letter, he fled to Richmond, and he was welcomed with open arms by the Confederacy. So consider the context of Converse. Was he a traitor, or was he just someone speaking his mind? The second example, and perhaps the most entertaining one, involved this little-known editor out in Dubuque, Iowa, known as Dennis Mahoney, an Irish immigrant who was a very strong Copperhead or Peace Democrat, or, in other words, the strongest opponent of Lincoln you could get in the Democratic Party. Now, he was known for his outspoken criticism of Lincoln and the war in general, even though, ironically, at the beginning of the war, he tried to recruit troops, but was denied by the Republican governor of Iowa. And because of his criticism, he was arrested in July of 1862 and sent to prison in Washington, D.C. Now, he lived in Iowa, and he sent all the way to Washington, D.C. to be put in military prison. And after his arrest, let's just say his paper didn't stop criticizing the government. Here's what they had to say about Abraham Lincoln somewhat sarcastically. Long live Abraham Lincoln, who gives us more liberty than we know what to do with. And after his release 3 months later, Mahoney decided to write kind of a tell-all biography of his experiences as a prisoner and as an arrestee. And in the book, he wrote a very nice introduction to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a somewhat sarcastic dedication. Here's what he had to say. No one has occurred to my mind who has so well earned the unenviable distinction as yourself of having your name connected imperishably with the infamy of the acts of outrage, tyranny, and despotism which the book I hereby dedicate to you will publish to the American people. Now, Mahoney is eventually going to sell the Herald, but the Herald will remain to be a very strong anti-Lincoln newspaper in Iowa. The third example was probably the most prominent one. It involved the Democratic newspaper, the Chicago Times. Now, the Chicago Times had for a long time been very critical of Lincoln, but it had been very careful to not blur the line between what we call sedition and freedom of speech or freedom of the press. But after Lincoln appointed Ambrose Burnside, the man who was involved in that Vallandigham arrest, in charge of that military district out in the Midwest, well, he found the Chicago Times to be an easy target. And especially after they said something like this in an editorial about emancipation. It will be known in all history as the most wicked, atrocious, and revolting deed in the annals of civilization. Now, the publisher of the Chicago Times, Mr. Story, had a heads up by a military officer that his paper was about to be shut down. So he went to a judge, and the judge said, okay, we're going to not allow your paper to get shut down. We're going to talk it out in court the next morning. Before they're able to appear in court, the Chicago Times was seized by military officers under the order of Burnside. And immediately this created a big problem for Lincoln because the Times was one of the leading Democratic newspapers in the Midwest. And not only that, he received a lot of arguments from his friends, especially Senator Orville Browning and Lyman Trumbull from Illinois, who said, this is not a good idea, this is a leading paper, it doesn't look good. His own Secretary of Navy, Gideon Welles, noted in his diary that day that it was the kind of thing that would only add fuel to the fire in terms of opposition, and only encourage further opposition to the war. So Lincoln almost immediately suppressed the order. He got rid of the order and allowed the Times to resume publication. That's a pretty interesting example, given the fact that the President of the United States is basically going against the military order, his own general. Yet, at the same time, it shows how Lincoln had restraint when it came to dealing with newspapers. And it showed a lot of courage because both the governor of Illinois as well as Indiana both said that paper should have been shut down. So, there's one last example we're going to talk about. It's a local example from New Jersey. It involved the Newark Evening Journal and its editor, Edward N. Fuller. Fuller was a guy who moved around the country a lot. He eventually settles in Washington State and becomes a very prominent newspaper guy out there, around Tacoma. But at the time of the Civil War, he's the editor of the Newark Evening Journal, another Democratic newspaper. And he was another guy very critical of Lincoln during the course of the war. Fuller got in hot water for the following editorial from July 21st, 1864, where he said, "It will be seen that Mr. Lincoln has called for another 500,000 men. Those who wish to be butchered will please step forward. We hope that the people of New Jersey will at once put their feet down and insist not a man shall be forced out of the state to engage in abolition butchery." Fuller gets arrested, but unlike the other examples, he was arrested by a civilian court. Now, that's unique because usually in the case of Mahoney and the Chicago Times, as well as Converse, the military was the one that did all the stuff. But also, given he got away with it, he got fined, it's just interesting. Now, in summary, I think it's interesting to note out that despite the 300 suppressions of newspapers, Lincoln did show a lot of restraint, as well as the government. Most of these newspapers, the Times, even the Herald, they were allowed to continue publishing, and they didn't stop their message from being spread.